of Marx, a fire and Engels came to the checkout at the 7-Eleven. Marx was good, but he had sense. Engels, Lenin, the necessary fence.
I guess my next question deals with this problem of nationalism and internationalism, because after the collapse of the USSR and in the height of the anti-globalization movement, there were a lot of conflicts that transpired that were nationalist in character, and people had difficulty in understanding that, something like the breakup of Yugoslavia. And people at that same time thought that, given this new neoliberal order, nationalism was gone, it was not this like important thing. So there's like a funny contradiction that occurred. How are we to sort of deal with this nationalism, internationalism problem today? It seems like people have very small groups, but they're also increasingly atomized and isolated in their trade union work or in leftist circles.
Yeah. Perry Anderson said that the irony of the era of globalization was that it was one in which nationalisms were exploding like firecrackers all over the globe. The limits of that have also been apparent, however, in that every one of those nationalisms has been obviously constrained by and captive to Wall Street, the City of London, the dynamics of globalization, and the national bourgeoisies which they thought they were building, for the most part. There are no national bourgeoisies left, maybe except the American, but I don't even think the American. You know, they are oriented to accumulating transnationally. They want to get their state to support them accumulating transnationally, but they're oriented to. The most popular strategy of the labor movement everywhere in the world, including those mobilized by communist parties, has always been tied to nationalism. In the social democratic case, it's been about building an alliance with a national bourgeoisie, an industrial bourgeoisie, using tariffs to protect your industry, have an alliance between the working class and that industrial bourgeoisie. That's been the basic laborist or social democratic strategy. It's now out the window. It's gone. It's one of the reasons that social democratic reformism is gone. The communist revolutions that succeeded were successful because they were better nationalists. And succeeded for various reasons, but one of the reasons they succeeded was that they showed themselves to be better nationalists than the capitalists. That was crucial to the Chinese Revolution, it was crucial to the Yugoslav Revolution, and even in the Soviet Revolution, which was the most internationalist, certainly until to the Stalinist recrudescence. A compromise was made, as it had to be made in a way, given the multinational nature of the Tsarist empire that was overthrown. A compromise was made with nationalism, which was as much Leninist as Stalinist, but both of them involved incorporating national identity, protecting national identity. It was a compromise with the left nationalists in those movements. And, you know, insofar as independence struggles are nothing to sneeze at, insofar as colonialism and foreign oppression is something that people deeply feel, and has been one of the positive things about the 20th century that's been overthrown. Maybe that compromise had to be made, but the result of it, in the multinational communist states, was that nationalism and national identity was kept alive. It was sustained. And also the resentment against great Russian nationalism or Serbian nationalism of the dominant nations in those multinational communist federations was kept alive, right? Because they were still seen as the dominant group. So that all of the tinder was left when you took the lid off the garbage can for the nationalist explosion. You know, when you finally were able to express a politics. It either took the form of an expression through religion, where that could have been a basis of collective organization. It was the case in Poland, where the Catholic Church was allowed to be a major organizational element under communism. And it exploded in nationalism in Yugoslavia and in the old Soviet Union. Much more than in religion, although that was not unimportant either. And these were the two arenas in which people could organize with relative autonomy. They could not organize as workers with relative autonomy. Ironically. And this is what Rosa Luxemburg said to Lenin at the time of the decision to ban opposition parties and to close down the presses. She said, without freedom of speech, without freedom of organization, workers cannot learn how to organize themselves, how to develop themselves. And it was precisely the banning above all of workers' organizations, other than the Leninist one, that made it almost inevitable that workers were going to be least capable of organizing themselves qua workers, qua socialists, right? As opposed to organizing themselves as Lithuanians, right? Or organizing themselves as Croatians, or organizing themselves as Catholics. Or where they did organize themselves as workers, to organize themselves as Catholic workers, as happened in Solidarity in Poland. So it was one of the terrible ironies of repressing working class organization, that you were creating the conditions when it all fell apart, that the only options would be anti-socialist. The same is true in China today. You can almost say anything in China today, right? Unless you actually try to organize independent unions. Unless you try to put forward an alternative type of communism or socialism. There's some room for it in the universities, where the old Marxism-Leninism is still allowed to be taught, but not much. And this is the tragedy of repressing working class organization and socialist organization.
I guess my next question is, I think this is a related question, is where does this fear of party politics come from? Like during the anti-globalization movement, there was very much a sense of networking, as we were saying before the event, and also a kind of reinvented popular front kind of style politics. And people really thought that the left was what you did if you didn't do party politics, in a sense. And that's
it was very boring.
Yeah.
I mean, if you hung around, the NDP, it was deadly. There was only one constituency in all of Toronto where, in central Toronto, where the NDP had some life, where, a meeting could be conceivably interesting, and that was when Dan Heap ran, where I live right down here. And he would actually mobilize door-to-door campaigns for people to go talk to people, not during elections. Not only stick your foot in the door and say something banal to a 65-year-old Chinese woman who hardly speaks any English. Do you know who won you old age pensions in 1928? Which is what you say in order to get them to vote NDP, or you think you do. But Dan Heap would actually organize people, activists in his party organization. It was actually Alice Heap who's the real organizer in that duo and his wife. To go and talk to people about the anti-war struggles, the cruise missile issues in the early 80s, and the list was long, or on pro-choice issues. These were deadly organizations, really boring. I mean, parliamentary socialism, resolutionary socialism is a very, very boring thing. There was a time when party life wasn't like this. And when even trade union life wasn't like this, when it was fun to go to a party or union meeting. Now, admittedly, that was at a time when the center of working class life wasn't the Dufferin Mall. When consumerism did not consume working class consciousness nearly as much. When there wasn't television to occupy your evenings. When going to hear a good speaker was, who could be humorous, was almost as good as watching the Bill Cosby show in terms of getting a laugh. And when men could leave on an evening without having to make dinner, without having washed up, and to go to a union meeting, and then would stay home one night while women went to the women's auxiliary, as they were officially called, right? And where they'd be called Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Smith, not in the Communist Party, but often even in the Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party. So they were boring. That's not the only reason. You know, obviously, it has something to do with the limits of parliamentary politics and the limits of Leninist politics. Quite rightly so. You know, that what was wonderful about the women's movement, the New Left, and then the anti-globalization movement, was that it was to some extent picking up some of the culture, the best side of the culture of anarchism. You know, it was a mess organizationally, but it was much more free-spirited organizationally, and more fun culturally, and didn't worry very much about who we were going to elect to represent us, how we were going to make them accountable, didn't worry about keeping minutes. Now, there are limits to that, and we've seen the limits to it, which is that you start again at every meeting. There are effective leaders. There are always leaders. There's a tyranny of structuralistness, as the feminist, socialist feminist Jill Freeman said in the 1970s, which is that there are effective leaders, but if they aren't elected, they aren't accountable, right? In which way do you actually, are the people they claim to represent able to influence them and affect them and control them, etc.? And this really is a problem in the social movement. So never, hardly ever analyzed in any of the social movement literature in universities. It's astonishing. I mean, it's actually disgusting that the social movement literature, which is so popular in postmodernist universities, doesn't address this question. You know, is so critical of parties, of working class organizations, etc., and never addresses, are social movement leaders accountable? How are they accountable? To whom are they accountable? It's really astonishing. I say that as a political scientist in terms of the limitations of that literature. So, you know, there are reasons that are understandable, and I think, in fact, I'm positive that what we are now seeing is a development not dissimilar to the way that many people who were syndicalists or anarchists went into socialist parties just before and just after World War I, where they are going to take the cultural creativity and experimentation of non-party movement building into an attempt to build organizations, where they will attempt to discover new ways of developing representation and accountability that aren't as anal and constrained as were what was practiced by socialist movements and trade unions especially in the centuries before. And I think, you know, in any historical perspective, it's to be expected that those organizations, which really were the first time in history that subordinate classes had organized themselves into permanent organizations. And there had always been slave revolts. There had always been bread riots. But it wasn't until the great mass trade unions, and especially the socialist parties, were created between 1880 and 1920, that you had long-standing organizations of the subordinate classes. It never existed in history. And it had to do with the emergence, of course, of the working class. In that sense, Marx was right about the emergence of the proletariat, but also with the development of bourgeois democracy, because you had freedom of association that came with it. So you had permanent organizations. Well, it wasn't very surprising that those organizations wouldn't discover the institutional means of developing popular capacities, the institutional means of democratization of a substantive kind that would allow you to get past liberal democracy, capitalist liberal democracy. It's capitalism is a very young system in any historical sense, and a very dynamic one, politically as well as economically and culturally. I think what is now happening, and I think we're going to see this through the 21st century, I mean, your generation, most of you will see it much more than mine, will be the development of new organizational means. I hesitate because you're right to say the new left is dead, so we can't keep saying new. How does one find a new word for new? You know, that is going to blow past the institutional limits of parties, and yet will create new organizations that will be functionally what parties want it to be. Whether they'll have the word party or not is not important. Initially, and I hope forever, they will not be primarily oriented to getting into the state and introducing policies. That's not to say getting into the state isn't important. But it's mainly important in order to be able to use the resources of the state to do what the parties in their best sense were doing. Educating, giving those who don't have organizational means the means to fight capital in the state, even though it often makes it uncomfortable for you if you're a government in the state. To give poor people the organizational means to challenge those policies, right? To say they're insufficient, right? To mobilize against them. This was, the participatory budgeting could never do that. If you ask the Workers' Party to hire you a bus to go protest against the cutting of state services under the Workers' Party, they would say we can't do that, right? This would be defined as clientelism. And you can see why they would try to avoid being charged with that. But the key to entering the state is to use the state's resources to still be a cadre, to still be an educator, to still be an organizer, right? If you become a policymaker solely, right, you lose the transformative capacities. So it is about getting into the state ultimately, but it's not that as the end in itself. It's in order to raise the level of political development, of capacity building, that a party, a socialist movement ought to be all about.
I think we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
I think you don't abandon the parts of Marx or Marxism that are probably still the most, are definitely the most richest legacy for giving you the framework for asking those questions. You know, whether it's reading the Communist Manifesto, or it's Marx's debate with Bakunin, or it's reading the Critique of the Gotha Program, or it's Marx's image, somewhat idealized, of what the Paris Commune was, in terms of what we've just been talking about, of the type of movement that you want to build, right? Or Rosa Luxemburg's questions to Lenin, right? You don't abandon Marxism in the sense of understanding that it's not, you know, it's not a workers' movement, it's not a class movement you're trying to build because workers in some sense have the sun shining out of their rear ends that you're building it for. It's because the nature of capitalism is such that if workers deny their labor to it, they really screw up the system. Right? In other words, the workers occupy a particularly crucial functional role within capitalism. You know, a lot of people, especially after postmodernism today, go around with an image of sexism, racism, classism, right? As though you're talking about class as an oppression in the same sense that racism and sexism is. And class has an oppression attached to it. The difference of class, of the concept of class, is that while we want as many identities as possible to flourish in a socialist future, We want the type of class movements that will encourage diversity. We don't want 20 new classes in a socialist future. We're trying to get rid of class, right? Class isn't something, isn't an identity in that sense. And it's not an identity in that sense because when you speak of workers being oppressed, that doesn't mean they don't have power. Capitalists don't deny workers power. They invest them with power because they are dependent on them for production. Right? Of course, they also oppress them. They also constrain them. They do everything to limit the use of that power. But the whole point about the working class is that, sure, the power is asymmetric, but that within capitalism, that class has power. Okay, so in that sense, Marxism's valued, right? And you have to have it. And I'm not speaking of abandoning Marxism in that sense. I do think we need to abandon the type of Leninism, or Marxism-Leninism, to be fair, that was, I think, or is, I think, not fruitful in terms of doing the kind of critique and building that we need.
Isn't the working class there?
Of course it is. It's there in greater profusion than it's ever been, globally speaking. You know, during this 30 years when so much of the left has abandoned class, or only used it in this rather silly identity way, you've seen without doubt, you've seen more people become proletarians than ever in history. Without any question. That's obviously true of China. Right? It doesn't even need to make the point, right? As peasants have been turned into workers in the classical sense that Marx described. But I think it's even true in our societies where it's less obvious, because we had an image of workers as industrial workers, those who were first organized, right? But in fact, if you guys, as we were saying, you know, trade unionism has been decimated, but where it hasn't been decimated is in the public sector. People who would never thought of themselves as workers, who would never have put a value on the concept of solidarity. Who are they? They're statisticians in the Public Service Alliance of Canada. They are nurses in hospitals. Right? They are librarians at Bloor & Young. These were often people who were seen as the political base of a fascist movement, right? The civil service, the Beamte of the state, who were often, you know, the source of the fascist movement. You know, we're going to see that portion of the working class now viciously attacked. Precisely because public sector trade unionism is the one element of trade unionism that hasn't been decimated. And that's where the attack will now be located. And there'll be an appeal to private sector workers. Why should they have pensions? Right? Why should women in the public sector have the kind of maternity benefits they do when women in the private sector don't? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list will be long. It's going to be massive. It's going to be one of the costs that we're going to have to bear. And I think it's going to be very hard to beat back. But I say this in the sense, we'll have to see. I think they'll be involved in an enormous struggle. And I think with creative leadership, a lot of those public sector workers could become socialists. Göran Therborn, the great Swedish Marxist, maybe today ex-Marxist, member of the Communist Party in the 60s, one of those people who courageously joined the Communist Party in the 60s. Once wrote a book called What Does the Ruling Class Do When It Rules? All his books have a question, titled with a question mark. Good book, 1979. And he ended it with the argument that unless we can turn public sector workers into the cadre of a socialist transformation, we can't undertake a socialist transformation. And I think that was a very perceptive comment. So yeah, I think that it's not, the class will remake itself. I mean, what was wrong with the notion of the making of the English working class was the impression was created, I'm not sure Thompson meant it, that it was made by the end of the Chartist movement once and for all. Right? That was it. You now had it made. Right? Obviously that was wrong. The bourgeoisie is constantly remaking itself. That's what makes it the revolutionary class. Right? And working classes are remaking themselves, sometimes not in good ways. But in a lot of the ways in which the working classes have remade themselves, even in this contemporary era, have not been bad. The example I was giving of the feminization of the labor movement for all of what has been lost is very important. I think that also applies to it being a much more racially diverse and openly racially diverse labor movement, although I think a lot of what has been said about the labor movement in that respect was very unfair. The labor movement in a country like this was always very, very open to each wave of immigrants. And they were crucial to labor organization. And I don't think there was nearly as much racism in the labor movement ever as has been implied in a lot of postmodernist critiques.
What does the international situation mean for organizing, and does Marxism tell us something? Can Marxism tell us something?
Well, I've been engaged in the last 10 years, not spending my time studying working class parties and unions, which is what I spent most of my time doing, and the relationship of the state to them, but trying to develop a new Marxist theory of empire. Since I'm convinced that the old Marxist theory of imperialism is an albatross around our necks, which leads us, when we hear the word empire and imperialism, to immediately think in terms of inter-imperial rivalry, which leads us to think in terms of concentrated capitalist classes, monopoly capitalists, who control their state and who engage in state-led competition against one another. I think that was even a mistaken way of looking at the world before 1914 in some respects, although in some respects it wasn't entirely wrong. But for the post-1945 period, it's been fundamentally wrong. For all kinds of reasons. One, states are not simply representatives of concentrated monopoly capital. Two, the other empires have been integrated into the American empire. The closest linkages between the American state and other states are with the other former imperial states of Europe, Japan, etc. The bourgeoisies of those states see the American state as the ultimate guarantor of property and of property rights. That's not to say that they don't see their own states as very important to them, as very functional to them. It doesn't mean that they become American. It doesn't mean that they become transnational in some cultural sense. They still are French, they still are Italian, they still are Canadian in all of the limited ways that our bourgeoisie is Canadian. But they don't look to their state to establish an exclusive sphere of accumulation for them. And other capitalist classes are encouraged to locate within the boundaries of those nation states to accumulate and to compete with domestic capital. The American state has led that struggle, and it has won it very largely in terms of removing capital controls, diminishing tariffs, etc., etc. So in that sense, the old Marxist theory of imperialism is gone. It also was wrong, even in its Luxemburgist sense, to assume that the reason you had imperialism was that it was no longer possible to accumulate. You'd reached the frontiers of accumulation within your own borders. Right? And this was utterly ridiculous even in 1914. The notion that the reason that Teddy Roosevelt was in Central America was because the American state had reached the end of the frontier is almost laughable. And yet if you go back and look at the kinds of ideas that were percolating in Hilferding and that gave rise to the other theories, this was the notion, well, California had yet barely been developed. And yet, moreover, it had not yet been discovered how to accumulate through the working class. It was assumed that capitalism would immiserate workers. On the contrary, what was already going on is that unions were being formed, right? The welfare state was already visible. Right? Workers were able to increase their buying power. Of course, they were increasing their productivity along with it. Right? So you could accumulate domestically by deepening capital accumulation at home. Capitalism has not primarily depended, least of all, the crucial capitalism of the 20th century, American capitalism, has least of all depended, right, on its foreign adventures. That's not to say that it doesn't exist as an empire of extended political rule. It does. And it oppresses all kinds of people, and above all, it stops revolutions elsewhere. That's the main thing it does, right? Which would get in the way of the movement of American capital. And now it's well beyond American capital. The American state is the representative of global capital. It stands up for the rights of capital anywhere, not just American capital. Much more than that. In that sense, it's a global empire. So I think we need to get away. I don't think the Canadian state is imperialist. Do I think that indigenous peoples have been oppressed within Canada? Of course. But to use the term imperialism for that is to lose the meaning of the term, as far as I'm concerned. An empire is one of extended political rule, i.e. beyond its borders. And the empire we have today is the American state, which has been burdened with the responsibility of making and managing global capitalism and reorganizing other states so they cooperate in that process. That's what empire is today. The use of imperialism by most of the left, which came out of the anti-colonial struggle or came out of the anti-dependency struggle in Latin America, has been essentially a dependency use of the term. Right? That is, the theory of development and underdevelopment as dependency. And imperialism has become the term for that. The term imperialism is emotive. It's been very important in mobilizations. I wouldn't want to throw it out the window. I don't mind it being used in that loose way. But it's a very unscientific use of it, I think. The effect of it is essentially that when you see Canadian investment in Ohio, you define Canada as imperialist. Right? If there's a shift of the surplus from one place to another, that gives you the essence of the notion of imperialism. It's useless. It's utterly useless. There can be sub-imperialisms. Brazil probably is playing that role in the southern cone of Latin America. South Africa certainly is in the southern cone of Africa, maybe all of Africa. But that's not because primarily that you can see that there's South African investment in Mozambique. This is a very lousy way of defining imperialism. It's connected to, are there open borders to investment? But just in terms of whether the surplus moves across borders is I think, a very lousy way to use it, and we should get rid of it. And I think it's useful to use it in a rhetorical way in terms of the native struggle in Canada. But scientifically, it's not worth much.
Is that possible, or is that just a reorganization of empire?
Yeah, no, it's a reorganization of empire. One of the tragedies of movement discourse, as effective and important as it was that it was a rights discourse. Women were winning rights. And they did. And that's not unimportant in vis-a-vis states which are oppressive, even if they're liberal democratic. But they moved then very quickly to using that rights discourse and inviting the most powerful state in the world to establish rights for other people. You saw this above all with Rwanda, and for good reason in a way, right? It then shifted to Bosnia. Without much thought given to, well, if you're calling, and it was the left, the liberal left, or sometimes the social democratic left, that was calling for, the movement left, that was calling for the United States to intervene elsewhere in order to establish those rights. Because it is, after all, the only state that's really capable of doing it. Right? And you forget that, well, why does the United States do this? Why do they suddenly concern themselves with the rights of women in Afghanistan especially? Right? That's not to say that the leaders and even bureaucrats in those states aren't somewhat motivated by, it would be nice if Afghani women could go to school, but they didn't care about it much when they were defeating communists who, were being defeated largely because they moved too quickly in the villages in terms of putting girls into school in 1979, 1980. That's the main thing that got them into trouble. So what was not seen was that if the American state goes in to establish rights, it goes in for all kinds of reasons that don't have to do just with rights. Obviously, the main reason that the United States bombed Yugoslavia was to show to NATO that, to show to the rest of Europe that NATO would be the policeman of Europe in the post-Soviet period. That was the main reason they went in. It wasn't an economic reason, it wasn't about pipelines, it was about establishing NATO as the policeman of Europe. The main reason, of course, that they went into Iraq was to ensure that Saddam Hussein would not be able to build up, once sanctions were not being effective, the type of oil revenues which would allow for a foreign policy in the Middle East which was not subject to Saudi Arabian and American control. That was the reason that they went in. Right? So any of these notions around rights, which is human rights imperialism, as Amy Bartholomew's article in the Socialist Register in '94 called it, human rights as swords of empire, right, was absolutely right. It is very important. That's why we need an understanding of empire. Right? Not because we think rights are unimportant. Right? And we need to be encouraging and giving all the support we possibly can to Afghani women to be struggling for their rights, to Chinese workers to be developing an independent labor movement, right? But that's entirely different than demanding the American state not allow China into the WTO because there isn't an independent labor movement in China, which was what the AFL-CIO's position was. Okay? It's an entirely different thing. People struggling where they are to win those rights, as opposed to asking the empire to impose those rights, which I assure you, since those rights are denied because of the ruling forces in place, Afghani women weren't going to get it anyway. Right? The amount of women who've been liberated in Afghanistan, even in the parts of Afghanistan that the Americans or NATO controls, is minuscule because of the local forces there.
How does one sort of avoid neoconservatism and yet at the same time avoid a kind of anti-imperialism of resentment that sort of just like because the American state just has bad motives,
I don't even think the American state always has bad motives. I think it is, sometimes the motives may be, who knows what's deluding people in terms of what they think they're going to accomplish. It isn't always bad motives. I don't think that Michael Ignatieff, for all of his cynicism, would like to see rights established everywhere. I think his motives are probably true. I think he just is blinkered in terms of not seeing that when the American empire is installing them, and installing them without a shift in the basic structure of the state and the basic class structure of those societies, those rights are abstract and become the vehicle for other political projects. So I don't think it's about motives, although heaven knows Cheney's motives were the worst conceivable, but that depends on who you're talking about. But I think you're really right to pose this question. I mean, we are all the more internationalists than ever. And by we, I really mean that in the broadest sense, in that Sikhs in Canada, Greeks in Canada, take that example, given what's going on in Greece today, are able to function politically as though they're in Greece. They can watch Greek television, they can listen to Greek radio, they can read Greek newspapers, as live, right, in time, right? So they can be engaged in Greek politics more than ever. It used to be the case that, a Greek worker would come to Canada, he would follow Greek politics, he can send money back, but it would be 2 months late, right? I mean, they can live as though they're in Greece. They can't go on the demo, but that's about it, right? And of course, we're internationalist in the sense that, I think that the effects of globalization, culturally, in terms of communications and economically, are such as to make us much more aware of what's going on in the world, and in a liberal, positive way as well, not just in a socialist way. So people want to see changes elsewhere. I think that's right. And I think you're right that in the absence of a socialist international movement, there is a tendency to throw money at problems via NGOs, which are extremely undemocratic in their internal organization. Greenpeace is the great example, which I often admire in terms of their militant actions. They don't just issue petitions, they'll often put a ship in the way of harm's way. But what does Greenpeace do? It's very good at collecting $5 door to door. It never brings people together and makes a collective argument. Right? Never. There's a set of activists, but all of the people who give to Greenpeace remain isolated individuals. Right? And this is a real problem. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the reasons why young people who are internationalists should be so committed to building political organizations where they are that can then link up. And to do that in a non-naive and romantic way, so that they really are not just throwing support, but are really political in the sense of, well, what are you running up against in terms of what you want to do and can't do? Which is what should have been asked of the Soviet leadership or activists. That's what we need, and and the tragedy is that this takes a long time. This is a process of decades. It's a process where people will have to throw themselves into this and know that it's not a game, that one needs to do it for the long haul. And that's what's hard to do. I think it's going to happen. I think the 21st century is going to be a century. I don't know if the right word is party building, because I don't even know if the right word is socialism. It doesn't matter. That's a matter of lexicon. It wouldn't hurt if it was socialism, because there's a legacy that we want to retain. It wouldn't hurt if it was Marxism understood in a creative way, because that's a legacy we want to retain. It wouldn't hurt if it was party, because that's a legacy we want to retain. But it really doesn't matter all that much, provided the functional equivalent is being developed. When Marx spoke of the bourgeoisie as being revolutionary, he didn't just mean it in the sense that it overthrew the aristocracy, which in most places it didn't. In most places it entered into a coalition with the aristocracy. And certainly not in the sense that it overthrew slavery, although in a much more analytic sense, in the sense that it established wage labor and competitive labor markets. It was revolutionary. I think he meant it in the sense that it was transformative of the way people lived, the way they went about producing their subsistence, the way in which they created cultures in the broadest sense of culture. as well as in the transformation of the means of production, technologically revolutionary, and labor processes. And in all of those senses, the bourgeoisie has not only remained revolutionary, but has arguably been more revolutionary in the last 50 years, and maybe even given the telecommunications and internet revolution we've lived through, and the transformation of the working class that we were talking about, maybe been as much or more revolutionary than ever. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't do all kinds of reactionary things. When Marx was speaking of that bourgeoisie as the most revolutionary class in the 1840s, think of what it was doing, right? In India, right, or anywhere. Think of what it was doing in Manchester. Right? Think of the barbarism of that class in many ways. Right? And think of its cultural limitations as well. But so in saying that it's revolutionary, I don't mean it in the sense of it is at the cutting edge of civilization, right? In that sense of we're civilizing the world. But in the sense of the transformation of people's lives, of the way they go about living, it's been the most revolutionary class. And it still is. That often involves political revolution as well, transformation of the way the state functions, etc. Working classes have been revolutionary. At local levels, you could, even in this country, find it. Transform the way cultures have existed in my city in North Winnipeg. I think the effect of the Winnipeg General Strike and what went into making it and what happened after it was a revolution of an important kind in the way people lived and functioned, which was then defeated. Counter-revolutions occurred. I think that the revolutions that we've seen in this century have genuinely been working class and peasant revolutions. I don't think they've been about state capitalism. What the kinds of societies they created, I don't know what they were. Marxism has a very bad handle on what the hell the Soviet Union was. It wasn't communism as Marx understood it, but it also wasn't capitalism, certainly. And only some people began figuring it out at the end of that regime. What was the essential set of class relations that defined that. So I'm not sure where else that question goes, except to say that what we're talking about in the sense of a socialist revolution, or the working class as being revolutionary, has to do with, is that our working class is capable of transforming the way people live. For your second question of structural reforms, that's the $64 question. It's not that unemployment insurance or mother's allowance is a non-revolutionary reform and nationalizing the banks is a clearly revolutionary reform. We've got to find ways of making mother's allowance reforms of a kind that allow it to be built on, that are connected with developing people's capacities to run their own lives, to transform the state, to challenge capital. Nationalizing the banks can be a very non-revolutionary reform, as we've just seen. Right? It can be a band-aid for defending and reproducing capitalism and capitalist social relations. Even when it's undertaken with revolutionary rhetoric. Francois Mitterrand nationalized the banks in France in the 1980s. And he did it with socialist rhetoric. It was the most radical program in Western Europe since 1945. As Gaston Defferre said very cynically, Mitterrand learned to speak socialist. Right? But the banks were run in the exact same way as when they had been private commercial banks. Their function wasn't transformed whatsoever. And then they were privatized by the end of the year. So it's not so much a matter about which reform, although there's no question that if you nationalize the banks in a certain way, that they become central to a set of democratic decisions about what's produced, where it's produced, how it's produced, then it becomes a much more central structural reform than unemployment insurance could ever be, right? Or welfare benefits could ever be. But it's not that welfare benefits can't be structural, right? Now, the big problem is this nationalist internationalism. Because if we are internationalists, then you also have to think about those reforms in terms of, do they have internationalist potential? So the worst thing about reading Andre Gortz's remarkable socialist ecology book, Farewell to the Working Class, 1980. Gortz was a remarkable Italian-French autonomist Marxist. And it was a strong critique of Marx for valuing labor, i.e. what we ought to be trying to do is get rid of labor as alienated labor, rather than speaking of the dignity of labor. We ought to reduce labor to the minimum of alienated labor, as opposed to self-directed labor, to the minimum amount of time. So he said, look, France is such a rich society by 1980 that we could retain our standard of living if we all only worked 18 hours a day. And then all the rest of it, 18 hours a week. Sorry, 18 hours a week. And the rest of it can be self-directed labor. We will establish means of production available to people like we have libraries. And they can go and try to construct what they want, you know, as groups, etc., in self-directed. Well, and it ends with an election. A socialist president who really believes in this is elected, and he institutes this. But across from Marseille is North Africa. And can you speak of France as isolated in this way? And what does it mean that, yes, French workers could live at that standard of living, right? Defined in that way as a standard of living, right? When North Africa is across the Mediterranean there, right? And that becomes, you know, the real kicker of trying to think through these types of structural reforms. How do you engage in a politics that wins people to what the needs that they genuinely have, but also is involved in the types of reforms that is transforming what their conception of the standard of living is? So that the center of working class night is not the Dufferin Mall. Right? And I'm trapped in this. You know, it'd be easy for me to talk about this, but I'm as trapped in it as any worker. You know, for me, it's not the Dufferin Mall, but it's a more expensive mall. Right? So we're all trapped in this, and you know, the revolutionary reforms have to be about the capacity to remake ourselves in such a way that a massive amount of redistribution will need to go on between the North and the South. It's going to happen anyway. The proletariatization of the South is going to force the standards of living of the North down. There is the most basic market analysis, let alone Marxist one, will tell you this. Right? It's impossible to conceive of it otherwise. Right? The entry of the Chinese proletariat into world production at this level cannot but have the effect of lowering the standard of living of the Western working class. But we don't have to accept a lower standard of living defined that way. We have to, and this obviously for ecological reasons, this is crucial. We have to be redefining what we mean by standard of living, and people have to come to embrace that and want it. Now, you know, when you start raising all of this, you start saying, oh, fuck. What are we talking about? And in a sense, that's really true. I mean, that is really the case. We're talking about climbing mountains. It's just, what's the point of living if you're a progressive person if you aren't trying to do this? I mean, where's the fun in it? You know, as you live your life through, if you aren't at least attempting to climb that mountain. But the chances of doing it aren't all that great. And in that sense, Marx was wrong. Marx, after all, was a young man, think about it, was a young man coming into maturity, 18, 19, 20, right? At a time when he could look back at the French Revolution in the way we speak of the 60s. Doesn't seem all that long ago. So he did think in terms of revolutions as something that were imminent. Right? And if 1848 didn't happen, he was sober about that. Okay? But then there was a massive financial crisis, very similar to this one, in 1858. And he and Engels were full of it. Right. Now it's going to happen. The conditions weren't there in 48, but now it's going to happen. It's in the Grundrisse. You see it. It was in his writings in the New York Herald. You know, it was there. And Marx is generally very much against what it means to be an historical materialist. Have wanted as human beings to see revolution in their own lifetime. But who wouldn't? But it hasn't been very good Marxism. Right? To see this transformation, given how dynamic he saw capitalism was. At times he was very sober about this. He said, given what's going on in California in the 1870s, you know, I'm not sure that a revolution in Europe is going to matter all that much. Right? You know, we get glimpses of this. But you know, we tended to want this to happen in our own lifetimes. And when he said instead, you know, bury on, old bull, that's the way you need to think. Yeah, you're going to be engaged in this struggle, and you'll make your contribution to what is going to be a very long and difficult process that you may not see the end of. What were those stonemasons or priests who were building the cathedrals that were started in the year 1100 and completed in the year 1500 thinking? Right? You need to think about it that way. Much more than thinking about building a cathedral, of course, but it's that kind of thought, that this is a collective transgenerational enterprise.
I think I have to cut it off for time, but thank you very much.